Katakuri is the perfect warrior who never lays on his back. Since birth, he's been the model example of perfection. But unfortunately, Luffy shattered his self-image and made him see reality for what it is. So the question today is whether or not Marco can do the same thing and defeat Katakuri. As the first commander of the Sweet Generals, Katakuri has the second most important role other than being the captain. Now, most pirate crews are ruthless, but Big Mom is not only ruthless, but also very stupid. Due to her constant hunger pains, Katakuri is forced to protect his siblings, not only from his enemies, but also their own mother. His ambition to protect his family is what caused him to develop Conqueror's Haki. The man who can see the future is one of the oldest commanders, even older than Marco at age 48. He is someone who was alive even during the Rocks era, and because of his mentality and Haki prowess, many people think Katakuri is perfect and has absolutely no flaws, but during Whole Cake, we learned this is obviously not true, but nonetheless, Katakuri is the most skilled first commander aside from Roronoa Zoro. Now let's talk about Marco. He is 45 years old and was traveling with Whitebeard for over 20 years. After the Marineford War, he led the Whitebeard pirates in a war against Blackbeard, and he and his crew lost a very tough battle. Now when it comes to Marco, many people hold him in high regard, and that's mostly due to his status. When it comes to his actual feats, they are impressive, but compared to the other first commanders, these feats don't stand out that much. Being the right-hand man of Whitebeard, many people automatically assume Marco is the strongest Whitebeard commander, but I believe Jozu and Vista are pretty much on the same level as Marco. For starters, the Whitebeard commanders are not ranked in order of strength. They all have the same level of command. Now during an SBS, Oda actually explained that each commander, regardless of number and strength, holds the same rank on Whitebeard's ship, which also explains why Odin was Whitebeard's second commander, even though he was clearly much stronger than Marco. Many fans have this belief that every pirate crew is a meritocracy, but that's only true for Kaido and Big Mom. But when it comes to Whitebeard and Shanks, for lack of a better term, are good guys, and Kaido and Big Mom are bad guys. When it comes to Shanks, he is said to have the most balanced crew, and as for Whitebeard, his pirate crew is literally a family. Marco, Jozu, and Vista all have identical feats when it comes to Marineford, yet Jozu and Vista are 3rd and 5th division commanders. We also know that Izo, who was Whitebeard's 16th commander, is also comparable to Kaido's 3rd commander. So I think the entire commander scaling system needs a rework. But moving on, this is a good time to get into the feats because this is where the main controversy comes from. Off the bat, many fans will point to this databook where it says Marco fought evenly against the admirals. And now the databooks are helpful and sometimes they are a reliable source of information, but for this specific entry, it is literally just false. And this is also not the first time a databook has been incorrect. When it comes to Marco, it's very obvious he's not equal to the admirals in any shape or form. We can actually look at Marineford to prove this. Since Marco can heal instantly, he kind of just came out of Marineford without any injuries and looked a lot better than someone like Jozu, and this might be the reason he was called equal, but if we look at the actual feats, it's really just not true at all. So Marco's first attack on Kizaru was so weak that Kizaru jokes about the damage he's taken, and Marco himself acknowledges that he's absolutely doing no damage, and Kizaru gets up immediately as if he's never even been hit. He also hit Akiji off guard and still did absolutely no damage. Marco's main ability is to heal. He's not even an actual fighter, he's a doctor, so this is why he hasn't shown any extraordinary combat skills. Pretty standard combat for the most part. Now, if we compare Marco's feats to Jozu, Marco hits Akiji off guard and does no damage, whereas Jozu hits Akiji off guard and actually makes him bleed and stutter, and he continues to hold off Akiji for a while. So based on their actual Marineford feats, Jozu's attack power should be better than Marco's, and this is actually not surprising either because Marco is a physical fighter, and he has used his flames for defense and offense, but his strongest attacks are usually physical attacks, and this is why Jozu's attack power is better. Looking at Jozu, it's very obvious he has the most physical strength of any Whitebeard commander. He actually has the best strength feats in all of Marineford, where he picks up a giant glacier that's so massive it makes the giants look like dwarves. Right, so since Jozu and Marco both primarily use physical attacks, it's very clear to see why Jozu's attack power would be better than Marco's. So honestly, for being honest, Marco is just as close to the admirals as Jozu and Vista, and neither of them are equals. Marineford itself basically proves this because after being whooped by Whitebeard, Akainu was still able to take on all of the Whitebeard commanders, and some of them got destroyed. So clearly, Akainu was stronger than them, and I don't know who this guy is, but he's getting roasted alive. So yeah, the commanders are not even close to the admirals at all. It's just not close. Now looking at more of Marco's feats, he was extremely impressive in his fight against King and Queen, and he was able to hold them off for a while and overpower them at certain points. But King did most of the work, and Queen didn't take any serious damage, and obviously King took no damage at all. Marco loses the fight mostly to King, so overall what he did was impressive, but the outcome was pretty much inevitable. Alright, so now it's time to look into Katakuri's feats. Going into his fight with Luffy, he was better than Luffy in every way, shape, and form. To put it simply, in terms of abilities, he could essentially do what Luffy was doing, but better and stronger. His mochi was sticky, and with his haki, he made it extremely powerful. Now, speaking of haki, Katakuri was the first to tell Luffy about different colors of armament, and while this might not be advanced form of armament haki, Katakuri's armament haki is still more impressive than the other first commanders, besides Zoro, obviously. And in terms of observation haki, he's actually one of the best users in the entire world. There's only a handful of characters with Future Sight, and Katakuri is one of them. I'm pretty sure there's only like 5 right now. His fighting style revolves around using Future Sight in order to mimic Logia abilities and make his body seem intangible. Luffy eventually was able to get past his ability and start landing critical hits on Katakuri. When it comes to Katakuri, even after figuring out his technique, Katakuri was able to adapt and start to dominate once again. Later during the battle, after achieving Future Sight, Luffy uses Snake Man to start outspeeding Katakuri, and at some point Katakuri gets straight up blitzed. But like I said before, Katakuri is very adaptable, and after realizing what Luffy is doing, he begins to evade Snake Man to the point that he turns his body into a bunch of goop, and he also turns his body into a donut and was still outspeeding Snake Man. So by the end of the fight, many fans speculate whether or not Katakuri let Luffy win, especially if we consider the fact that Katakuri stabbed himself. But either way, by the end of this battle, Luffy and Katakuri were pretty much equals. I guess you could try and give Katakuri the edge. Either way, I think Luffy might have the edge, but it doesn't really matter. Pretty much equals. Now it's time to compare Katakuri to Marco based on the feats I presented. If you would like a full analysis on the battle between Luffy and Katakuri, drop a comment down below. But let's get into the comparison. Starting with overall strength and attack power, this category is easily going to Katakuri. As I explained earlier in the video, Marco and Jozu are relative, and Jozu has better overall AP. He was the only commander capable of hurting an admiral. Yes, he caught Aokiji off guard, but so did Marco, and he still did no damage, so Jozu's AP is just better. Deal with it. Jozu also got caught lacking by Dofi and was completely unable to break out of his strings. Now comparing that to Dressrosa Luffy, who easily broke free of Doflamingo strings, we can see that he has much better physical strength than Jozu, and as I explained earlier in this video, Marco and Jozu's AP mainly comes from their physical strength, and this would mean that Luffy and Dressrosa would have better AP than both Marco and Jozu, which I think is a pretty valid point because King Kong Gun should pretty much scale higher than anything we saw from Jozu. Now going into Whole Cake, Luffy's AP should be significantly above both Marco and Jozu, Haki being the main reason, and since Katakuri was able to overpower Whole Cake Luffy and has better Haki overall, it's fair to say Katakuri's AP should also be better than Marco's. Now moving on to speed, for the most part, Marco's best speed feat is fighting Kizaru. Even though Marco's fast enough to keep up with Kizaru, I wouldn't say he's equal in speed. Speed in One Piece is really not as important as people think it is. Unless there's like a huge gap, it won't really decide the fight. So I think in terms of speed, these two should have no problem keeping up with each other. Some people have said that Katakuri wouldn't be fast enough to fight Kizaru, except this is entirely false, because Katakuri would be able to fight Kizaru even better than Marco. According to the Vivre card, only those with exceptional observation Haki can spot Kizaru, so obviously this would mean Marco's observation Haki is pretty good, but I think it goes without question that Katakuri's observation Haki is a lot better since he has the advanced application. This should be common sense anyway. The person who can see the future should have better reaction speed than the person who can't, so at the very least, Katakuri is more than fast enough to fight and react with Marco. Now, Snake Man is a technique where Luffy bounces off the air, and every time his arm bounces, his speed rapidly accelerates, and no limitations have been placed on this acceleration, so we don't know how fast he can get, but I think it's definitely fast enough to outspeed Marco, based on the fact that Katakuri had to use Future Sight to counter it. And since Katakuri can see the future, Marco is going to have a big problem adapting to someone who can see everything before it happens, but giving Marco the benefit of the doubt, he should be able to manage just fine since he was able to keep up with Kizaru, but Katakuri's reaction speed is definitely a lot faster, which is pretty obvious. Now moving on to durability and stamina, the main argument for this would be Marco is a mythical zone, therefore his durability is better, and sometimes that argument makes sense, but sometimes when comparing powerful characters, the argument doesn't make sense. So in terms of durability, it's a bit tricky because Marco's durability hasn't really been that special compared to other zone devil fruits, but he instantly heals from attacks, so his body never actually suffers any real injuries. But he can still run out of stamina with enough time and enough damage, so overall his durability should be better than Katakuri. Now as for endurance, I would say Katakuri's Haki is a lot stronger than Marco's, and he has shown enough endurance to take hits from Boundman and Snake Man Luffy for over 15 hours. His Haki should be strong enough to defend against Marco without too much difficulty. I think in terms of overall defense, Marco does have the advantage though because he can constantly heal, and Katakuri's Haki and AP should be better than Marco, so I think it kind of evens out. But in a 1v1 scenario, Katakuri should be able to last long enough to drop Marco since he was fighting someone with overall better AP than Marco. Now, moving on to the most important difference between Marco and Katakuri, in my opinion, that would be the Haki. Now, according to Kaido, Haki is what transcends all, but that is not always the end-all be-all, because sometimes we have characters with stronger Haki who scale lower than characters with weaker Haki. When it comes to Marco, his physical strength and attack power are just not better than Katakuri, and he hasn't shown any notable Haki feats, so this specific situation, Haki definitely matters, and Katakuri uses an advanced form of Haki as a part of his entire fighting style. And when fighting against someone like Snake Man, Katakuri was getting blitzed by Snake Man at first, but then he used Future Sight to understand the technique and began to outpace and overpower Luffy. Now his arm and Haki is shown to be a lot more powerful than Luffy's, and I would also argue that Luffy's Haki during Whole Cake is obviously stronger than Marco's, so Katakuri's Haki should also scale above Marco's since Marco has like 0 prominent Haki feats. And if we look at the fighting style, due to his awakening, Katakuri can literally create things out of thin air, and of course he's able to coat these things in Haki. But to end this debate, I think Marco has better defense since he is a mythical zone, which already gives him great recovery speed, so the fact that he instantly heals kind of just puts him above Katakuri in terms of defense. But anyways, in conclusion, Katakuri should be able to defeat Marco with around the same level of difficulty as he did Luffy. Luffy's defense obviously wouldn't be as good as Marco's since Marco can obviously just keep healing, but in literally every other metric besides speed, Katakuri and Luffy just outclass Marco, so I think the Minister of Flowers should end up taking the dub. But what do you guys think? Drop a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.